Done so already, I want you to turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11 this morning. Hebrews chapter 11. For those of you who don't know, Jenna and I ultimately met at Union Baptist across the county here, but we really got to know each other through serving at Camp Maranatha in the summers. And Camp Maranatha to this day, and counseling at Camp Maranatha is one of the hardest things that I've ever done. It is one of the most fruitful and most immediately rewarding things that I've ever done in terms of seeing the fruits of your labor, but it was long weeks, and they've shortened the week some now, and I think that was for good reason. I remember the first time I counseled, my sister Mallory was kind of the camp nurse, and she was counseling some too when they needed her. My first week counseling at Camp Maranatha, the kids were just horrible. I mean, they didn't listen. I mean, they did everything that you didn't want a kid to do at camp, they were doing and they were trying to do. And I was supposed to be one of the older counselors at Camp Maranatha, and it was tough. I was so worn out. I was so broken by the end of that week. I actually went and found my sister on Friday night after the closing ceremony and just fell into her and just wept because I was so exhausted. I was so challenged. I was so tired. But it's a great ministry to be a part of. And so if you're ever looking for something to do in the summer, then I encourage those in middle school and high school and in college as well to go and give it a shot if you're feeling led to do so. Because as difficult as it was, it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. But at Camp Maranatha, I remember there was a couple of things that we would do to get students out of kind of the routine of the week. You know, you could only go to the pool and go play carpet ball and go to the gym and play basketball and, go to horses so many times. And so you had about 3 or 4 hours every afternoon where you were given the chance to have free time. And one of the things that you could do if you could get a group to go and do this with you was to take a hike to West Pasture. Has anybody ever been to West Pasture in Camp Maranatha? Show of hands, anybody? One, Miss Amy. We got one, Benton, back there in the back. Benton and Jennifer spent some time at Camp Maranatha as well. Camp Maranatha has about 250 acres of property off Floyd Road there in Danielsville, right off of Highway 98 when you're going in to Isla. If you go up the big hill and then down to the bottom, you turn left. Camp Maranatha is kind of tucked away in some of those pastures. And Camp Maranatha had this view called West Pasture. And West Pasture, when you hiked back there, I think it was about a 3-mile hike there, and then you could take a longer way back if you wanted to. It took a long time, so that's why most counselors would elect to take their campers back there because it would take up a lot of the afternoon. But it had challenges. You had to stay on the trail. There were hills. There were there was a creek that you had to cross. There were some different obstacles that you had to overcome to get to Camp Maranatha's West Pasture. And then you got back and you crossed this little hill and you saw a scene there that really didn't belong in northern Madison County. It's just acres and acres of rolling hills and pastures kind of looking towards the northwest, I guess, looking up towards Isla. And it just didn't seem to fit. And it was such a beautiful, breathtaking experience to take the kids there time after time, but we did it for a reason. We wanted to challenge them. We wanted to take them somewhere that was going to stretch them and that was going to stretch their time there at Camp Maranatha. So we would take them out to West Pasture. And what we see the author of Hebrews doing in chapter 11, he is taking the audience to West Pasture. He's taken them now at this point to heaven and back. He's talked about this Jesus who's gone through the heavens, who's passed through the heavens. In the first 10 chapters of Hebrews, there's obstacles, there's challenges. There's all these things that he's presenting to these believers who are questioning everything that they once believed and everything they once did and knew about Jesus Christ. And so he gets them through these first 10 chapters, and then we get to chapter 11, which is the ever-beloved Hall of Faith. The heroes of the Old Testament, that faith hall of fame. And what he wants to do through Hebrews chapter 11 is challenge his readers to live boldly for God. Everything that we did at Camp Maranatha was to challenge these new believers or these unsaved children to learn to live a life of faith in Jesus Christ. And that hike towards West Pasture, it had purpose, but ultimately it was to challenge them, it was to stretch them, and it was to grow them. And this is exactly what the author of Hebrews is doing in Hebrews chapter 11. He wants to challenge his readers then, and he wants to challenge us today to live boldly and live out our faith for Jesus Christ. There's a couple of misunderstandings about the Hall of Faith that I want to talk about this morning, and this is going to be one of those survey sermons where we do kind of an overview of chapter 11, and then we go back and pick up part of chapter 10 as well to close. One of the first things that we see about misunderstandings of the Hall of Faith is the misunderstanding of the meaning of faith. There's a couple of ways that terminology has been hijacked through the years that's really important for us to pause and reflect on to make sure we don't fall into the trap of misunderstanding what faith means. First of all, faith is not just about God's goodness to me. It is not just about God delivering something to me that I want or something that I ask for. Prosperity gospel preachers and those who have the health and wellness and the name it and claim it gospels, now they pride themselves on this kind of teaching. And they reduce faith to simply getting something from God that you want, almost as if he's a genie in a bottle, and if you say the right thing, he's going to come out and grant you a wish. And that's not what faith is. Faith is much more than that. Faith is also not just a set of beliefs or creeds. Those can become stale, they can become static, but faith is actually dynamic. Faith is not static, it's active. Faith is putting into action what we believe about God and what he's proven himself to be true and how he's proven himself to be faithful to us. Faith is also not just a blind leap into the unknown. It's assurance and it's conviction. It's not just forsaking all logic and common sense and just putting your hopes in something that hasn't proven itself to be accurate. Hebrews begins in chapter 11 by saying faith is the assurance of the things hoped for and the convictions of the things not seen. So it's not just a blind leap. It's not just something that you do on a whim and you don't consider it and it doesn't have any empirical evidence. Faith is not a blind leap. And we do this in every other area of our life. It's about assurance. It's about conviction. And we have assurance and convictions about many things in life, and we don't see ourselves just taking a blind leap of faith. I didn't notice anyone when you came in looking at your pew and looking at the structural integrity of your pew. And you might say, well, that's an old example, Blaine. I've heard that for years and years, but it proves to be true. And even beyond that, even if you did come in and look at your pew and think it was raggedy, no one ever comes in and asks themselves if the people sitting on the pew are going to go above the weight capacity so the pew might crack. We don't do that. So we have assurance, we have conviction in this pew that you're sitting in right now. I have it on the stage that I'm standing on, but you don't come in and look behind and look underneath and look around this pew and test the structural integrity. You don't go and weigh every individual person to make sure it's going to hold everyone up, and that would be a very risky game to play if you did that. So I don't advise doing that. So we know that there are things in life that we have assurance of, that we have conviction of, and that we act upon. Everyone got here this morning by vehicle. You could not find someone who knows less about how vehicles work than I do. But even I know when I turn my key, it's supposed to turn over and it's supposed to crank, and I'm supposed to be able to put it in drive and go somewhere. I have assurance, I have conviction that when I do that, something is going to spark and go through, and it's going to have all the appropriate parts. But you know what I didn't do this morning? I didn't pop the hood and check and make sure those parts were there. Now, I would have no clue what I was looking for. If something was missing, I wouldn't even know. So I don't waste my time with that. I just call my father-in-law. I'm like, hey, the Jeep won't start. And he'll come over and he'll help me out, something like that. But we don't find ourselves every time we get in a vehicle opening up the hood and checking for every single part. We know that there's a conviction, there's an assurance that when we turn the key, the car is going to start and we're going to be able to go somewhere. So faith is not just a blind leap into the unknown. One of the most important things that I think we miss when we read through Hebrews chapter 11 is said here. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. What it does not say is that there is a conviction of things that are not real. It's a conviction in something that's real. It's an assurance that something exists, that God exists, and that he not only exists, but that everything that has been stated in Hebrews to this point in these first 10 chapters is accurate. So it's not that we have faith and assurance and conviction in something that's not there, and it's just a figment of our imagination. It's just not seen. And so faith is not a blind leap. It's just faith in something that we cannot see. The last misunderstanding that we hear about faith, and we hear this one often, we might say that someone is a person of deep faith, and that reduces faith to just a spiritual life. You might have someone in your life that seems very calm and seems very, very together, and they might be referred to as someone who has a deep sense of faith. And what we mean is they're just a spiritual person, and faith cannot be reduced to that. It is much more than that. So faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It's not just about God's goodness to me. It's not just about a set of belief. That's the faith. It's not just about a blind leap into the unknown, and it's not just being spiritual. The second thing that I would like to discuss with you all this morning about misunderstandings surrounding faith is the disqualifications of being in the hall of faith. We misunderstand the qualifications of how we could possibly ever find ourselves in such a list of individuals. Could you find yourself in Hebrews chapter 11? Hebrews chapter 11 is very much a who's who of the Old Testament. 16 individuals listed specifically, with several other examples that are given in these 40 verses about these men and these women who saw God move in their lives through a faith that obeys. And we know that God works through a faith that obeys. In Hebrews 11 is the author trying to challenge his audience to review this cliff notes or the spark notes of the Old Testament that stretches all the way from Genesis into the middle of 1 Samuel, looking at these individuals in their lives and how God used their faith to do very powerful things. We think that they're different from us. We open our Bible and we say, I can't be one of these individuals, and they are in the Bible, so we kind of disqualify ourselves immediately and say, there's no way I could ever find myself in this position. There's no way I could ever crack into this list of individuals that saw God move. But, we look at them and we think, of course they were able to act noble to the unseen God. Of course they were able to respond in these ways in a hostile world. But what we forget is that the life of faith and the life of boldness in faith of God is the norm for the people of God. It doesn't matter when we live. It doesn't matter the circumstance. It doesn't matter what exactly we're up against. It doesn't matter where we're from. It doesn't matter how old we are or we aren't. The Bible is full of different scenarios and different individuals that saw God move because they acted in faith. So we're not going to read through Hebrews chapter 11 in its entirety this morning. What I want to do is bring out a couple of things that the author of Hebrews defines faith as, that we can apply to our lives today, and then we can go back to chapter 10 of Hebrews and really piece together about a challenge for those of us who are in Christ this morning as the church today. Hebrews 11 defines faith as involving a couple of things. And if you have a handout this morning, you'll see these, and we've got a PowerPoint to go through in just a minute to tie things up at the end. Hebrews 11 defines faith as involving confident action in response to the unseen God and his promises. I want you guys to read Hebrews 11, verses 32 through 34 with me, and listen to all of the action words. Listen to all of the verbs that are here. It says, and what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms. They conquered. They performed acts of righteousness. They obtained promises. They shut the mouths of lions. They quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Think about all of the action that we see in that section of Hebrews. Think about how active they were instead of passive. I think so many times it's easy for us to, in the name of patience, just sit back and be passive and wait. We need to be patient. We need to trust in God's timing, but we also need to be willing to stand up for what's right and to step forward into what God is calling us to do and who He's called us to be. I would challenge you to read through Acts. Josh and I were talking about this the other day, actually. I would challenge you to read through Acts and look at Peter, and look at Paul, and look at the men of the early church and how they responded to trials, how they responded to persecution. Every single time there was an opportunity to make a difference. Now, they might be imprisoned, they might be beaten, they might be stoned, they might be chased out of a city, their lives might be threatened, but every single time there was an opportunity for them to have an influence where they found themselves, they did two things. They stood up and they stepped forward. And they spoke. Every single time through the book of Acts, we see the men of the early church. We see women as well in various opportunities stand up and step forward and speak out. They took action. And every single person in Hebrews chapter 11 took action based on what they believed to be true about God and what they had seen God do in their life. In 1974, there was a famous high walker whose name was Philippe Petit. And he had trained for years, and he had done a couple of really phenomenal feats across the world. In France, he was a Frenchman, and so he grew up learning how to do this in France. He ended up going to England and walking across some high wires and some tight ropes and some really impressive places. And then the World Trade Centers were built in the United States of America, and someone challenged him to come to America and to tightrope from one building to another. And so he kind of assessed the situation. I think it took about 2 years for them to get everything in order for him to even possibly able to accomplish this task. And so he's practicing, he's going over, he's waiting for the right weather. The day comes, and he's 1,400 feet in the air at this point. Now, if I fell off this stage, I would probably get hurt. You know, I have a great fear of heights. That's one of the reasons I don't fly and I don't go high on ladders. I call Ralph. Is Ralph here today? Ralph comes and he gets on a ladder for us. That's very kind of me calling somebody at Ralph's age to come get on a ladder. I know, and so. But he takes my candy and he hides my stuff for me in the office, so we go back and forth. And so I have a fear of heights. I can't even fathom being 100 feet in the air on something, much less 1,400 feet in the air. Now, he had practiced. He had everything done right. He had the situation exactly like he wanted to. And finally, he steps out. He goes across and he starts to walk. And he gained so much confidence the longer he stayed out there. He actually walked back and forth across this tightrope that spanned between one Trade Center tower to the other 8 times. And for the grand finale, he actually, on the tightrope with the balancing beam in his hand, took a bow, almost did a curtsy out there on the tightrope. And the interviewers came and asked him, what made this possible? What made you do this? He said, well, I had tightrope before, I had tight so I wasn't really worried about doing that. He said that the height was different. He said, but I've been at heights before that would have really challenged me. He said the altitude and the wind was the difference maker in this particular circumstance. And they said, well, what was it that made you be able to do this? He said, stepping off the building. He said, until I step off the building, it's all just a theory. He said, until I step off the building, until I took a step off that trade tower, he said, it was all just a theory. He knew that for this to happen, he knew to see this feat be performed that he had to step. And I wondered this morning, what area of your life you just need to step off the building into? What circumstance do you need to stand up in? Step forward in, speak out in. Now, we're supposed to speak the truth in love, but we're still supposed to speak. We're supposed to stand up. We're supposed to step forward. And maybe this morning, your faith has become static. Maybe you know the situation. Maybe you can stand back and tell every detail about the situation, about the obstacle before you, but you haven't stepped off the building. I think about Peter. For Peter to sink, he had to what? He had to step out of the boat. When was the last time you stepped out of the boat? When was the last time you saw an obstacle in front of you and you saw a situation that God could use you in and you were willing to step out of the boat? willing to step out on that wire to see what God might do. The second thing that Hebrews defines faith as, that I want to talk about this morning, is God's work of extraordinary miracles in the lives of otherwise ordinary people. If you read through these 16 individuals, some are pretty well known. Now, they're all well known to us if we've grown up in church because we know the stories and we've learned their lessons and we've read those passages. Some of them are grand. They were born in palaces. They were judges. They became kings. They built an ark when there was no rain, and they had all these different things that they had accomplished in their life. But most of them are pretty average Joes. You know, Abraham, just a man called to relocate with his family. Several of you in this room, I know, have relocated with your family. There may come a time again that you relocate with your family. You have a woman who's caught up in a life of sin that God blesses for her obedience and her faith. You have 2 sons who went on to bless their sons. We raise our children in a way today that honors and glorifies the Lord. There's nothing that noteworthy about that. You know, you think about a couple who spared their life of their child and the parents of Moses. We would all do that. We would all seek to save our children if they were in danger. So these are average Joe's, ordinary people, and beyond that, we know Noah was a drunk. We know Moses was a murderer. We know that David was an adulterer. We know that Isaac and Abraham both lied about their wives for various reasons. And we know that Gideon was a doubter. We know that these individuals, they were flawed. They weren't perfect. They didn't have every single thing figured out in their life together, so sometimes I think we're guilty of assessing a situation that's in front of us, and maybe we're not active in it because we think we're disqualified because of some imperfection in our life or something that we've done. Every single person in Hebrews chapter 11 has a very obvious flaw. Every single one of them has that one thing they wish they could take back and they wish that they could do over again. What this reminds us is that real faith is expressed by real people. Real faith is expressed by real people. I remember a guy at Emmanuel College when I was first going through the School of Christian Ministry. He taught an intro to Christian ministry class, and what he said was that people want a person in the pulpit and not a sage on the stage. People want to interact with someone who's real. People want to know that they can connect and that somebody in their life who's talking to them, who's praying with them, is real, that you're authentic and that you understand what other people are going through. They're real pilgrims of this journey through life who have not yet reached the heavenly city. Now, we believe God's promises are true. We believe that everything that we do and we see God do in us and through us and everything that He's done for us is to work out His perfect plan of glorifying Himself and restoring order in this world that He created, but we haven't seen those promises yet. We talked about this a few weeks ago earlier in Hebrews where they hadn't seen the fruition yet. They hadn't seen the fruit of their labor yet. And I know that there are many of us here today who fit perfectly in the story of Hebrews and in the letter of Hebrews, and you're wondering, did I make the wrong choice? How long am I going to have to wait? When is God going to deliver? When am I going to see the fruits of my faith? And what this passage tells us is that it doesn't always work out like we hope in this life, but God is still faithful to His promises, and He is still going to deliver. You know, we struggle through some mundane seasons and moments in life, and we forget that obedience sparked by faith in everyday situations landed these people in this chapter centuries ago. Everyday things, everyday occurrences, sparked by faith, obedience sparked by faith in God, landed them in there in Hebrews chapter 11. What is it in your life that could land you in Hebrews chapter 11 today? There's no decision, there's no area of your life that's so simple, that's so small that God cannot be glorified through it. There's nothing so great that He can't interject Himself into it and be glorified through it and use it for His purposes as well. This is about real people who have real faith dealing with real things in life. And we can be encouraged by that because we can find ourselves there too. The third thing that I want us to discuss this morning about what Hebrews chapter 11 says about faith is that it involves a variety of situations and a variety of outcomes. It has a variety of situations and it has a variety of outcomes. There's some immediate and positive responses to the faith in these individuals in Hebrews chapter 11. The children of Israel passed through the sea on dry land. The walls of Jericho fell down, and widows received back their dead by resurrection. So there's some immediate fruit that we see in our lives sometimes when we act on our faith in God and we're not passive and we stand up and we step forward and we speak out. There's some immediate fruit sometimes, but there's also some delayed and some negative responses to that. Abel remained murdered. Abraham had to wait decades for the son of promise. Many of these individuals were mocked, they were tortured, they were beaten, they were stoned, they were in prison, or worse. So what we take away from Hebrews chapter 11 is that faith takes action, understanding that we may not see the results in this life, but we can't make the mistake of thinking that it's not going to be rewarded by God. It's going to be rewarded by God. Listen to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 2. It says, "For it by the men of old gained approval." Flip over to verse 39 with me. "And all of these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us they would not be made perfect." Both of those situations, this entire chapter is sandwiched with two verses that say, by faith, men gained approval. Men gained approval. So how do we find ourselves in such a hallway? How do we find ourselves if we're not disqualified, if we know that we have the real life experiences that can land us in this chapter, that can land us today in November 26th of 2023, that could insert us into Hebrews chapter 11? How do we find ourselves in such a hallway? Well, I think the author has told us this, and I think a simple look back will reveal this, and the answer is simply this: by staying together. By staying together. We find ourselves living lives worthy of Hebrews chapter 11 and finding ourselves having the faith to be remembered like these men and women by living life together in community. You see, this is important to remember about Hebrews. This is a letter to a body of believers. It's not one that's written to an individual person. It's not one that's written to just one or two people. And the author at this point has set up his main thesis very clearly, and it's that Jesus is our great high priest. There's a new and better way. There's a living way. There's a new way to God that's available to all who would profess faith in Jesus Christ. And he's made this point very, very clearly. And so we get to chapter 11, and we open by saying this. What he's doing is he is now seeking to challenge his readers to live boldly for God. If we were to take time and to go back into Hebrews chapter 9 and 10, we would see and we would remember that he's compared the old and new covenants. He's compared the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly tabernacle. He's compared Jesus to the prophets and to the priests and to the kings of old and to the angels, and how he was far superior to all of those beings and all of those individuals. He's shown us what Jesus has done for us, and in Hebrews 11, what he's trying to get his audience to understand is what he can do with us. How God can be used in our life, how God can be used in those mundane things that seem like they're just boring Groundhog Day scenes where it's the same thing, it's the rat race over and over and over again, and you're thinking, is there not more? Does God not have more for me? Does God not have something else in store for me to see him use in my life? And I would challenge that by saying God is ready to use everything in your life, even as mundane as it might seem. He desires every single aspect and every single element of the life that he's given you, and the breath in your lungs and the blood pumping through your body right now. There is nothing that is so mundane that God cannot use it for his glory and for his purposes. Now, here's what's going to happen. After chapter 11, the author's going to get very practical in chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 begins with another therefore and another let us. But it's of great importance to understand that the last thing that he said before challenging his audience to reflect on their past the last thing he said before he challenges them in Hebrews chapter 11 is to reflect on their past and the past of those who have gone before them. He challenges them to look back in Hebrews 10, verses 26 through 39, and then he challenges them to look at those who have gone before them in the entirety of Hebrews chapter 11. And let me go back and read this last verse before he does these two things, because it's really important for us to understand. And this is Hebrews chapter 10. I'm going to start in verse 24. Let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. And immediately after that, he goes into a section. Remember, verses and headings are for our benefit, but immediately after he says that, he tells them in the rest of chapter 10, you can have Christ or you can have judgment. And then he finishes this chapter in verse 39 of chapter 10 by saying, but we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. He challenges them to stay together. And then he challenges them to remember how God has used them. He challenges them to examine a life of deliberate sin and the dangers and the damage that come from that. And then he challenges them to look at those heroes of old that they knew so well to see how God could use them. So let me take a few minutes as I close as your pastor in the post-COVID, uncommitted to church attendance era and share with you why this is so important. Because I'll be the first to say, people are far less committed to church and far less committed to being here post-COVID than they were prior to COVID. You go ask any pastor in the area, and I've talked to several, and they've said the same thing, how many times the average person attends worship service in 2023 per month? And they'll say probably twice. And what we've also all seen is that family or that couple or that individual who used to be okay with only missing once a month is now okay as long as they can attend once a month. We are far less faithful to being together and to assembling together than we were before COVID and the pandemic kind of upended our routines and our habits and our patterns. And let me share with you why this is so important. A community of faith helps us avoid the damage of deliberate sin. This is the first thing that the author of Hebrews says right after he says, let us not forsake our own assembling together. Listen to this in 26 through 32. For if we go on sinning willfully, after receiving the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve? He who has trampled under the foot under the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace. For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. As soon as he says, don't forsake this. As soon as he says, make sure you stay together, he gives a really clear picture of what happens when we don't. We lose accountability. We lose encouragement. We lose people checking in on us. We lose growing together and being encouraged and strengthened by having strength in numbers. And so a community of faith helps us avoid the damage of deliberate sin. Now, I know there are many people who say they can be a Christian without attending worship services and without attending church. And there might be some truth to that. And a lot of the things that I hear often from people are comments like, well, I can give to the poor, or I can help those who are in need without going to church. And I can read my Bible, and I can grow, and I can spend time in the Word without attending church. All those are true. My question is, do we? When we remove ourselves from accountability, when we remove ourselves from the encouragement of brothers and sisters in Christ, do we still do those things? Are we still active in our faith, or is that not when suddenly we become very passive? Is that not suddenly when our faith just becomes a creed and a set of beliefs, and all of a sudden it becomes this static thing in our life? It's immensely important to be committed to one another. It's immensely important to have a community of faith, because a community of faith helps us avoid the damage of deliberate sin. And the damage of deliberate sin is destruction. It's destruction. It's falling into the hands of a living God. One of the most terrifying verses in all of Scripture is in verse 31 right there. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of a living God. He's not a cosmic killjoy. He's not just someone sitting up in heaven with a long, white, fluffy beard waiting to zap us down and pat us on the back. He's real. Our faith is in something that is real, just unseen. And Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and Hebrews is walking us through chapter by chapter, telling us what Jesus provided for us. And then we get to this verse, and it says, "Don't forsake our own assembling, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." We look out for one another. We love one another, and we can help each other avoid the damage of deliberate sin. The second reason that this is so important is a community of faith helps us remember how God has used our obedience in the past and encourages us to act in the present. How God has used us. Maybe something's happened in your life and all of a sudden you do feel disqualified. All of a sudden you do feel like you would never belong in the hall of faith, that you can't fit, that something's happened and you've been removed from the possibility of ever being recognized as a person of faith. The community of faith comes along beside us and puts his arm around us and prays for us and encourages us and picks us up when we fall down, and it helps us keep pushing forward. It says, hey, I've been there. Hey, we've all made mistakes. Hey, let's figure this out together. We'll grow together. We'll work through it together. Let's press on in the faith. That's what a community of faith does. It helps us keep pushing forward. Pick up again with me in verse 32, because this is when the author of Hebrews really gets into this. He says, "But remember the former days, when after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet in a very little while, he who is coming will come, it will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul." So it helps us avoid the damage of deliberate sin. It holds us accountable. But it also helps pick us up and push us forward when we fall down. The last thing that this message and this passage teaches us is that community of faith helps us live as if we believe God is worth trusting and is telling the truth. It helps us live as if we believe God is worth trusting and as if he's telling the truth. And I very simply ask you this morning, are you living your life in such a way that others would observe, that others could take inventory and say, this person believes that God is telling the truth? There's probably an area in your life, there may be multiple areas in your life this morning where you're having a hard time trusting God. You're having a hard time believing that God is telling the truth. But the really important thing to remember is that this message comes at the swing point of Hebrews, where the author has built up this defense of who Jesus is for you. And now he's preparing us to take in what he can do through us in this life. He's done everything. He's everything what we need. God has provided everything for us in Christ Jesus. What more does he need to show? What more does he need to prove? He's telling the truth. He's worth trusting. Is your faith in him, or is it in something else this morning? Back in 2009, there was, on Easter Sunday, a couple who was headed to an average Easter gathering. and name was Carrie Sorensen and Ashley Hutchins. And they're headed to this Easter gathering. They're engaged, and all of a sudden he gets a call from an old classmate of his. His name is Dan Favio. Dan Favio was working as an air traffic controller in South Florida, and he received a call that there was a flight of 5, and there were these other individuals that were on the flight, and the pilot, on about a 1,500-mile flight, has a massive heart attack and passes away. And the father who was on the flight was one who had done a little bit of flying. He was retired at this point. He had done a little bit of flying, and so he knew enough to be dangerous in the air, I guess you could say. And so he radios in, and he says, hey, this is what's happened. And so Dan Favio takes this call, and he knows that there is someone in his life that can help with this. And so he picks up the phone, and he calls Carrie Sorensen. And so he begins to talk with Carrie and tell him what's happened, and he begins to walk him through the situation. And he called Carrie because Carrie had specific experience in flying planes like this one that was stranded in the air. And at this point, they gave it about a 10% chance of survival from this flight. And so Carrie and Ashley, they began to dig before they left. They turned around, they went back into their house, and they began to dig up manuals. They began to dig up these manuals for this plane that this family was on. It was a husband and a wife and their 2 daughters. And over 30 minutes of telephone and phone tag, they began to dispatch to Dan instructions for how this family could land this plane and end up in safety. And so finally, after 30 minutes, they reach a runway. They led them 1,000 miles through the air so that they could land into safety. And now, what Dan knew when he made that call was that Carrie might be hesitant because Carrie had lost his father to a plane crash, and then he had lost his stepfather to a plane crash. But Dan believed that Carrie was the one to help with the situation. So he picked up, he made a phone call, and they put everything together that they could, and the family is still alive and well today. And what this story and what this passage is trying to get us to understand is this: a community of faith. And this is why this is so important here today. And this is why everything I said last Sunday for Thanksgiving is so important to me, because this church has been that for my family and I. A community of faith provides us with the resources and the relationships to make a real difference. Provides us with the resources and relationships to make a real difference. And that is the heart of myself as your pastor. That's the heart of our staff, to provide you with, number one, a relationship with Jesus Christ, but to provide you with horizontal relationships that can make a vertical, real, lasting difference through resources that are available to us in 2023. A couple of days ago, I had the chance to be home for several days in a row, and always enjoyed Thanksgiving break. And used to do this thing with Roman and even Georgia Claire as she got a little bit older, where I'd wake up on mornings that I was home, and I would hang out with the kids and have them in the living room and everything, and we would always get up and snuggle on the couch together, and we'd watch some new cartoons. Normally I have Friday off, and so Friday was our cartoon morning, and I would get the kids on the couch, and we would watch cartoons, and we would probably watch for about an hour, then we'd get breakfast and things like that. And I realized, being at home for a couple of days for Thanksgiving, that didn't happen anymore. And I realized that, I missed it. And so I think it was Friday morning, I was talking with Roman, and he's in the floor, and he's playing with trains. I'm in the floor, and I was kind of cleaning up in the kitchen. And I said, Roman, how come we don't, watch cartoons in the morning anymore? Why did we stop doing that? And he didn't even look up without missing a beat. He said, you stopped asking. And the shockwave went through my body. And here I was, reflecting on this thing that I used to love so much, that had such a prominent place in my life and in my daily and weekly routine, standing there thinking, why did this stop? Dad, you stopped asking. So the next thing out of my mouth was, hey, let's sit down and watch something together. And so both kids were on the couch with me, and we watched a little bit of a movie together, and then we went on about the day. But is that not a picture of our faith sometimes? We wonder why things feel so static. We wonder why we remember these things that God has done for us, and we've seen God do, and we've seen Him move in our lives in such a way, and we can't figure out what's changed. And we ask Him, and He say, well, You stopped asking. God wants to move in your life. God wants to use you. But make no mistake, He will use every single person and every single relationship that you have and every single resource that we can compile together to continue working His community and this world that He loves and that we love so much back into its proper position of glory for Him. What area of your life do you need to ask God to show up in? What area of your life do you need to ask God to show up in? What area of your life do you need to step up, stand up, and speak out in? And let's see what God can do. As Bob comes this morning, I want to just challenge you ahead of the Christmas season to think about all the stories that we know from old, all the characters, all the passages that we'll go through the next couple of weeks as we reflect upon the Christmas season, and challenge yourself to think, put your position in their shoes and ask, what kind of faith it took to see this happen? What kind of faith it took to trust God in all the situations that we see through Luke chapter 1 and chapter 2, that we see in Matthew chapter 1 and chapter 2. And I pray that throughout this journey through Christmas and this journey to Bethlehem, as we've been on this journey through the heavens and back through Hebrews, that God will continue to grow your faith through the biblical examples and obedience that we see in these stories of old, just like we see in Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to ask if you'll